So at Focus Entertainment, I worked for 5 years as a line producer on numerous games, including the Farming Simulator franchise. And since 2020, 2020.
Oh, you have the microphone. It's not working?
Hello?
Yeah.
Ah, and since 2020, I specialize in release management. In all, I helped release hundreds of products, games, both digitally and physically, patches, DLCs, and season passes on all consoles and in a variety of territories. Please note that I will not talk here about the technical or design aspects of bringing a game on console, but rather on the process put in place by console manufacturers to release the game. By console manufacturers, I talk, of course, of Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, what we call the first parties. The company I work for, Focus Entertainment, has more than 10 years of expertise in releasing games on consoles, and we helped developers create best-selling franchises with our production, marketing, and business teams. Our goal is to offer players unique experiences, and for this we work with studios with high-quality, unique titles. Instead of looking for specific types of games to feed our catalog, we look for titles supported by the creative vision of talented developers. Whether publishing, financing, or distributing, the nature of a partnership with Focus is based on shared vision and values. So it might be obvious, but the goal of a game is to be released to players. But before we can release it on consoles, we have to meet the first party's requirements and policies. Those elements are put in place to protect the first party's brand and also to protect the players by offering a unified console experience. A title is allowed to release on their console once it gets through their certification process. Once approved from certification, it can be distributed digitally or in retail. Therefore, it's important to prepare certification throughout the life of the project. These tasks will be the chapter of this presentation. The pre-production cycle is here to remove the uncertainties of the project. Is the game worth making? Will it have an audience? Will it be fun to play? What will be the budget to make such a game? So very basic question. In the same way, towards the end of pre-production, once you have a better visibility of what the game will be, you need to think about how to bring the game on consoles. What are the features of your game? You will have to bring these features on console, so you need to know what they are. Will there be multiplayer, local or online, crossplay, DLCs? Do developers have access to the console's backend? In order to bring these features on consoles, you need to have access to the console's documentation. You also need to know the first party's requirements and define a planning for their implementation. By backend, I mean the PlayStation partners, Microsoft Partner Center, and Nintendo Developer Portal. And do developers have access to test kits? You need to know the technical challenges of developing on consoles, and therefore you need to have access to dev kits to estimate the work needed. Once you know on which console you will release the game, you can prepare the planning for certification, and if the game will be released physically, you'll also need to take into account the manufacturing of the boxes. So after pre-production, you have defined the scope of your game and on what platforms it will be released on. And now that you have access to the console backends, you can register your game to the first parties. Please note that usually for Sony and Microsoft, you will need to create a design document that sums up what your game will be. It's called the Global Product Proposal for Sony and the Game Submission Form for Microsoft. Once you have submitted these documents and get the concept approved, you can enter your game in the backends and you are given your game IDs. The game IDs are important because they are what your game is in the first party's infrastructure. It is basic information present on both your build and on digital stores. The name of the game, version number, publisher ID, parental control level, languages. It's what we call the master's info. If the master info of your builds are not correct, you may fail certification for basic reasons or may not even be able to start certification, which would be a loss of time. So at this stage, you know what your game features will be, and you have created the game entry in the backend. So you can start implementing these features in the console versions. But what you have to keep in mind is that some features require to be set up in the console backend. This is what we call the services. If your game will have multiplayers or DLCs, you need to make sure to configure these services of your game in the backend to support these features. For example, if you have DLC on a Nintendo Switch game, then you will have to request the e-commerce service in the Nintendo Developer Portal. Same thing, if you have a PlayStation 5 game with multiplayer, then you will have to request the Session Manager service in Sony's backend. Globally, ask yourself, how will I bring each feature on consoles? The first party's documentation will help you answer this question. So now you know how to bring each features on console, but you need to do it correctly. You need to follow the first party's guidelines. Each platform has its own name for it. Technical requirements on PlayStation, Xbox requirements on Xbox, load check guidelines on Nintendo Switch. Whatever their name, they are a collection of requirements that your game must follow before sending it to certification. And from now on, I will only use the term TRC, technical requirement. In the documentation, each TRC has a general rule to follow. For example, if a loading time exceeds 30 seconds, the application displays an animation. And there is also one or several test cases to check if the TRC is correctly implemented. These test cases are what the certification team are checking during the certification. This is what Sony, Microsoft, or Nintendo will check when they check your build. So it's important that for you to take into account these test cases in your QA strategy. I will come back to this later. Before implementing the TRCs, you need to list them and see if they apply to your game. If your game doesn't have multiplayer, so of course you do not need to follow the multiplayer TRCs. It will give you quickly a high-level vision of the work needed on the TRCs. Depending on the project, you can have from 10 to 80 TRCs to implement. On consoles, the release depends on the certification. So we need to have as few surprises as possible during the certification. Therefore, a best practice is to write clear design documents for some important feature, multiplayer, crossplay, mod system, even the visuals of the controller buttons. They need to describe how this feature will work technically, but also the user experience with mockups. Then you share these documents with the first parties for feedback. This way, you have a feedback on important features before the certification. The most accepted definition of the alpha stage is when the game is feature complete. It means that all platforms have built, correctly packaged, with the right master info, and it is recommended to have built a patch and a DLC sample for testing purposes. A patch system must be thought of in advance in order to avoid bad implementation. This way, players don't have too much to download with the patch system. And of course, at this stage, all the TRCs should be implemented and ready to test. For testing them, it depends on your company structure. Either you have internal QA, or you can hire quality assurance companies, also called QA lab. So the best is to schedule several testing and regression sessions. So you send your game to a QA lab, they test it, they tell you what are the TRC issues with them, you correct them, you send back a build with corrections, and so on with multiple companies. Later, during the beta stage, when the game is more complete, you also have the possibility to send your game to a pre-certification to the first parties. It allows you to test your game in the same conditions as certification with early builds. Also, at Alpha, you should have a good vision of what products will be available at release. Will there be a pre-order DLC, a special edition, a season pass? Because you will need to create this content, approve it via certifications, and prepare their release. So you need to have a clear understanding of all your products. After all the game content has been produced, the game reaches its beta stage. Only debugging remains at this stage. Like I said before, as the game is complete, it's good to send it to pre-certification with the first parties in order to have as much feedback as possible before the true certifications. So it means that you have already a good build pipeline, and branching system in place. Because from now on, you must be able to create retail builds, not just development builds. And there's also an important task to do during the beta. You need to obtain the age ratings of the game. The age ratings are used to classify video games based on suitability for target audiences. They define a minimum age and descriptors to inform on what controversial contents are in the game, such as violent or sexual content. And they can be seen on boxes or on digital store. There are two processes for age rating. For games that will be released physically, you need to send your game to review to official age ratings systems. Which ones? It depends on the release territories. For example, you will need PEGI for Europe or ESRB for North America. This is the classic process. You can start this process at beta because you need a build with full content, without blockers, without placeholders, all the English text, and voices must be implemented. Globally, this build sent to review must show what the game content will be. So you should not add new contentious material after the review. For example, if you add sexual content with a patch or DLC, you will need to start the age rating process again. You'll also need to share materials, videos showing the contentious materials with a description of this video, forms about the game, a localization kit. Each system asks for different elements. These elements are there for them to better understand what your game is, what are the contentious material in your game. Each system has its own price and review time, but you should take into account 6 weeks for this process, and it can cost up to 45,000 euros for all systems on all platforms. For digital-only game, the process is faster, as you can use the IARC process. The International Age Rating Coalition allows you to obtain most age ratings by completing a form asking questions about the content of the game. This process is free, and you have immediately the results, and it is already supported by the console backends. The age ratings are important because by knowing what they are, you can set up the parental control level in your console builds. So, after the beta, the project enters the certification stage. As a best practice, it is good to plan at least 2 certifications in your planning. So here's the global strategy for certification. Now that the game has been properly debugged, you should have builds which content is good enough to be released. Those are the release candidates, the RCs. The best is to plan several release candidates, weeks after weeks, until you have one that can be sent to certification. This build becomes the Gold Master Candidate 1, the GMC 1. Once you have this GMC 1, you must create a branch in your versioning system. Indeed, during the first certification, the first parties will report bugs. These issues can block the validation of the build. Therefore, they need to be addressed for the second certification. So this is why it's important to have a branch made on GMC 1, so that you can send to certification 2 the exact same build as GMC 1, but with the certification 1 issues fixed. This way, we secure the content of GMC 2 and we increase the chances to be approved during certification 2. If there are still 1 or 2 bugs seen during certification 2, you can ask the first parties to overlook them in exchange of fixing them in a patch. This is what we call a waiver. Once the game is approved by the first parties, the Gold Master candidate becomes the Gold Master. So you have to keep in mind to have a good versioning system. With it, during the certification process, your team can continue to work on content in the main branch for patches. With the requirements, the TRCs tested since the alpha stage, and with this certification strategy, approving your game on consoles should go relatively well. As I explained, the strategy is to plan multiple certification with fixing periods in between until the game is approved. In order to prepare your planning, you need to know how long this certification will take. The duration changes with each first-party certification team. Without going into too much detail, you should count 1 week of certification, 5 working days. And if you count the time of fixing and validation for a new GMC, the whole certification process can take a month. So you need to keep this in mind in your general planning. This may seem long, but please note that later, when the base game is approved and no major issues are reported by the first parties, the next certification for patches can be faster. Also, on some platforms, you have to book a certification slot in advance. So keep in mind that you can't always decide when the certification will start. When the game is approved, you can prepare the release of the game. If the game is digital only, you should count at least 2 weeks at minimum before the game can actually be released. And if the game is physical, then you have to take into account the disc and box manufacturing and their delivery time to retailers. This can vary widely between the release territories, the platforms, the quantity of boxes, the time of the year, but as a worst case scenario, you can count 3 months. Once the game is approved by the first parties, you have to prepare the release. If your game is released physically, the manufacturing can start. So before the approval of the game, you should have already prepared everything needed for the boxes. Inlay, disc label, flyers. You have set up the prices and the quantities. And for digital stores, you will need to prepare the game page, the text, the screenshots, the banners, the prices, the date and hour of release. This is the moment where you will set up all the products you decided will be there at release. The base game, the DLCs, the season pass, the special editions. So this is why you needed to have a clear vision of what you will release. And before the release, I advise to keep an eye on the following points. Test physical support. During manufacturing, you will receive discs or cartridges. It's important that you test these on your retail consoles. Test your product setups. If you are doing a season pass or a deluxe edition, you should order download codes and test that the right content is given on your retail consoles. You can also prepare a D1 patch. If needed, you can use the time between the base game submission and the release to continue to polish your game. So working on a day one patch can be worth considering in order to have the best game possible at release. And again, it's good to test this patch on retail consoles once they are approved. So the big day is finally here. Years of work have led to this moment. When your products are released, you should check that the store pages are online and players can buy and download everything. You should also check that your pre-order bonus is working well. And of course, you must keep an eye on the players' feedback through multiple communication channels, emails, forums, social media, streams, and you must set up a proper way for them to report issues. What information should they give to help you fix the issues? You must keep an eye on what bugs are reported by players, because you might need to do a hotfix patch soon. Also, you need to prepare a general patch plan for the first weeks of release. Finally, keep in mind not to release a patch at the end of the week. A patch should be released on Monday or Tuesday in order to quickly react during the rest of the week if something goes wrong. Murphy's Law is in full effect here. So with the game released, we have reached the end of development and the end of this presentation. Your game is now live. It's up to you to keep it relevant with updates, events, DLC, and so on. The process to release those is basically the same as releasing the base game. So as you can see now, releasing a game on console requires a lot of work and preparations. At Focus Entertainment, we have now released hundreds of pieces of content on numerous platforms, on console, but also on several PC digital stores, like Steam, Epic Game Store, Microsoft Store, GOG. And we have done pre-orders, physical special editions, season passes. We have experience in physical and digital releases. And we have several teams to help you release your game, a QA team to test your game, a playtest team to receive feedback at the key moment of development, a release management team, which I am a part of, to help you on age rating and certifications, a marketing team to make your game known, and a business team to better sell your game and benefit from great opportunities. So thanks to our dedicated teams, we were able to release great games such as A Plague Tale Innocence or SnowRunner. And I thank you for listening. And now, if you have any question, feel free to ask them.
Thank you very much, Maxime, for the great presentation. Are there any questions to Maxime? Yes?
Hello. A question from Maxime as well. Did you work with any game that contained explicit content? And if how would you go around communicating with the first party about it? What would be the time?
Well, it all depends how you define explicit content, but if there's, if it's still within such a certain limit, the first parties don't have any issues with releasing, 18 plus games. But we have never been in a case where the content was so extreme that there was a feedback from them.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. Can
Hello.
you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. So I'm Dima from Sparrosoft. So my question is, imagine the situation if you have released the game and you pass the certification or fine. Question is, the players discovered the critical issue and you want to fix that as far as you can. So could you just pass through the certification, or it's just required and will be took some time for that?
Well, it all depends on the situation, but if the situation is really extreme, you always have the possibility to discuss it with your, first parties contacts in order maybe to speed up the certification. But my advice on that, and in order to prepare things in advance, so of course, would be to test as soon on retail console and try to identify this issue before it happens. But we can't always control that. The other things I would do would be to try to unlock what we call the rapid patch as first as possible. So, for example, on PlayStation, as soon as you pass a certification without must fix issues, so important issues for Sony, then you can ask to do rapid patches, which is a patch without certification, and it's approved, within the day. So it's still relatively fast.
Any more questions, maybe?
Hello.
Hello.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Nintendo, as far as I know, allows to publish a store page only after an initial load check of the game, right?
Yeah, I believe that's correct. Yes.
So how would you go about announcing a game on multiple platforms, so Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo? Considering the fact that you can announce it on Nintendo relatively late.
You mean, yeah? How could you?
How would you organize the announcement of a game that will come, is planned to come out on all the platforms simultaneously, when you can announce it on Nintendo only after late in the porting process?
I'm not an expert at communication or marketing on this, but I think you can still communicate on Nintendo title before, of course, they are approved, before the load check process is finished. But maybe we are not able to publish a game store page on the eShop, Nintendo eShop, before the game is approved. But
Yeah,
you
that's
could
right.
still communicate on it, but not have the page released on the eShop. I am not 100% sure, but on the top of my head, that's what I would do.
All right. Thank you very much.